Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. As Diana said, my name is Dodds Berger, and I'm also part of the agency and law project here in Helsinki. And today I want to present some intuitions, actually, I have about this topic, which is the title of my presentation is, as you see, who best fits the mask, agency, and the problem of personification in legal theory. If there is something like personification, but basically what I try to say is if they are going to be the recognition of new agents as persons, and that is especially and specifically what the starting point of my talk. And it's that the question whether non-human animals or whether non-human animal entities and artificial agents should be granted personality has become increasingly important. And I think that one of the reasons for this is that all these entities show or display some degrees of agency, right? And that leads me to the question I want to explore in this talk. And this is the question that you can see here, right? What kind of agency must an entity possess to be considered a person rather than a thing? Right, it's a difficult question, but to do this, I want to develop this argument focusing on two models of personhood and agency. Right. And these two models are, I call it the autonomy-based model and the representation-based model. These two models I present you today are, of course, generalizations. Generalizations based on a historical, philosophical perspective on personhood of agency, but I think that they remain highly relevant for understanding our current legal systems. Why I say historicals? Because I draw on two fundamental thinkers to base my generalization, which are Immanuel Kant and Thomas Hobbes. So the ideas of Immanuel Kant and Thomas Hobbes are the models I'm going to be discussing today. And even though both thinkers are different in their approaches, I think both are part of what I call the liberal model of legal agency. And that is something I'm going to discuss at the end, I think. So I want to proceed in this way. So the talk is going to proceed. First, I want to present the autonomy-based model, of course, regarding personhood and agency, and then I'm going to do the same with the representation-based model. And at the end, I want to reflect on some problems and possibilities these models raise, particularly regarding whether and in what form new types of agency can or should be recognized in law. So in that sense, my presentation is going to be more general because I want to discuss models. So, but we can discuss specific later. So let me briefly present the first model, the autonomy-based model. And I think that this model will be familiar to many of you because its best or well-known form is part of Kant's practical philosophy. And of course, is the result of the European Enlightenment movement, right? So, what is a person basically within this framework or for this model? Persons are moral entities acting within a sensory medium, which already shows you that we are dealing here not just with a legal dimension, but also with a moral dimension. Now I want to present some features or characteristics of this model that I think that you should know already, but I think are the core of the understanding of personhood, and I think are part of the understanding of agency as well. So first of all, persons are rational agents, which means that are capable of understanding and acting according to law. Here, of course, I'm not referring to rationality just as a way of thinking, but I'm referring to the capacity to act according to general principles. And if you know something about Kant, well, he has a really important general principle which is called the categorical imperative, right? The most universal one. Second, autonomy. Persons are self-legislating agents, which means that they act according to laws that they give themselves, of course, through reason. And for Kant, and I think for most of the people working in this framework, autonomy is the key element of human dignity, actually. And that was also the case for Kant. For Kant, there was something like of absolute worth or value regarding those agents or those entities that can act autonomously. So autonomy is related to dignity. Third, freedom of the will. And well, you were talking about that, but here I'm taking maybe a different approach. But of course, freedom of the will in general is closely related to autonomy. And just to make it short, I would say that this model assumes that there is some kind of negative freedom. Negative freedom means the independent from external influences, and positive freedom will be the capacity to act to self-imposed laws. That's why I say that it's related to autonomy, but because at the end, autonomy is the most, is the realization, I would say, of positive freedom. Then responsibility. So a person can act on reasons, and their action can be attributed to them. And this, of course, is related to the problem of moral personality. And finally is universality, which means that personality is intrinsic to all rational beings. And that's why it cannot be granted or revoked by political authority and applies universally to all humans, agents. Right. But, of course, as you may think, this is more close to what we would call moral personality, right? Or morality. And you will be totally correct. So that's why it's important to make the distinction between moral personality and legal personality. And well, moral personality is the capacity of the subject to act according to the moral law and be accountable for their actions. In that sense, in a very Kantian way, morality means act exclusively for the sake of duty, right? But on the other hand, the mere conformity or non-conformity of an action with the law, irrespective of the incentive behind it, is what we call normally legality, right? So, a legal action is performed in accord with duty, but not necessarily out of duty. So, if moral personality refers to the capacity to be subject to the moral law and be accountable for one's own actions, legal personality, in contrast, is the capacity to be a subject of legal rights and duties within a legal order. So, if we take this different in consideration, we're going to see that autonomy or freedom take a different meaning within the scope of the law. Why? Because both refers to the external realm, not to the idea of an inner freedom or an inner dimensional freedom that would be what we normally call morality, but it refers to the external interaction or external actions between individuals. And that's why I wanted to show you here something that you some may know, that it's the definition of right by Kant. And he writes in the Metaphysics of Moral, right is therefore the sum of the conditions under which the choice of one can be united with the choice of another in accordance with the universal law of freedom. Beyond the complex meaning of universal law of freedom, what I want to highlight here is the idea of that legal freedom is about choices. It's about freedom of choice, and not necessarily the idea of a will guided by the internal acknowledgement of the moral law. So we can make here a clear distinction between legal freedom, moral freedom. Now I want to say something about agency, because what I was saying was, of course, about personhood, personality, right? In this model, so the autonomy-based model, agency can be referred in two ways, and I think that's important to make the distinction. The agency presupposed for personality, and agency in what I would call agency in law, or agency stricto sensu. Well, what I'm trying to say with this, right? First, regarding the agency presupposed for personhood, I say that in the autonomy-based model, there is something of intrinsic value in personhood in general, which is recognized by the law and protected by the state and the state law, of course. So that means that there is some kind of limit to the power of the state and the legal regulation that the state can establish. And this is, of course, a moral category, a moral agency. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that the autonomy-based model, even for the law, is presupposing some kind of moral agency. Right. But, of course, that is the idea of agency presupposed by the idea of person. But what happened with the person who are already recognized, or we already studied they are persons? Of course, there is what I call agency law, or agency stricto sensu, which means that it's the capacity to acquire rights and obligations through one's own acts. And there is one, I think, requirement, at least for Kant, which is independence, which means basically that an individual must not be under the will of another. So dependence prevents the ability to obligate oneself freely, which is quite normal if you take in consideration the situation of a child, for instance. Okay. So because I don't have so much time, I'm going to say something about the representation-based model, right? Here we have a different or an alternative understanding of personhood, which is not based on autonomy or on the idea of free will. And so how do we define a person within this framework? Is, as you see, a person is the masking of a sensory phenomenon within a legal or a normative framework. Which means that from this perspective, rights, duties, and legal status are fundamentally relational or institutional. So they depend, basically, of what the law says. And because this idea is based on representation, and this is something that you can see quite well here, by the definition, this is, of course, Hobbes. Hobbes refers to the idea of the mask, a mask being an element of theater. So basically, a person is always a person for or in relation to some audience. So in this model, there is not some kind of intrinsic or inherent value of something to be considered a legal person. And that's why we can see, well, again, that there are two ways to understand a person in this sense. If an individual acts or speaks for themselves, so they are natural persons. If someone acts or speaks on behalf of another, well, they are basically artificial persons. But it's not just the idea of representation. What matters here is also the idea of authorization, because it's not that you are going to say that you represent someone without authorization. And that's why we find two ways of authorization, which are true representation, in which the represented party has authorized the representative, and the fictional representation, in which the represented party has authorized the representative. Because I'm running out of time, I'm going to say something that maybe is more interesting, which is the last part, which is, I call rethinking legal agency. Sounds quite strong idea, but I just want to show here some reflections about problems of possibility within these two models, because I think these two models are already present. Think about legal positivism. Legal positivism is basically what I was saying about Thomas Hobbes. And think today, not necessarily natural law, but even the idea of human rights is totally based on the idea of the model I was referring as autonomy-based model. So I think this is not just something that matters to people who cares about history. Right. Sorry. And what I want to think is that, what can we learn from these two models? And the thing that I want to focus here is about the digital world. I mean, today if we think that we are autonomous selves, we are confronted with the reality that in the digital world, normally we are just part of networks, right? There is big data, there is something called predictive analytics, which I didn't know so much, but it's quite interesting because basically they can, in some way they try to know what you want even before you want it, and because they are using big data and so forth and so on. So, if we think about that reality, so maybe AI as well, there is some advantages by the representation-based model, because the representation-based model, because it's based on representation, and the idea of artificial persons, we can use that to recognize, for instance, AI, corporation, animals, rivers as legal persons. But of course, via representation, right? Not as full agents. But there's a problem. Because if person one is purely conferred, I mean by the state, by the law, or Hobbes would say by the sovereign, it can be withdrawn arbitrarily, even for humans. And we already saw that in the middle of the 20th century, right? So the thing is that without a moral ground, extended legal personhood could have, I'm not sure about that, but could have the risk of undermining the idea that the law addresses responsible agents. And now, regarding the autonomy-based model, right? Here, maybe it will be most difficult, the personification or the recognition of these new agents as legal person. Why? Because there is this strong presupposition which is moral responsibility, right? But I think that, and it's something that you may know, even if moral responsibility within this framework is still the cornerstone of the understanding of person, both moral and legal, I think that it's possible to use the idea of fictions, even Kant recognizes, for instance, the organs of the states as quality with a goal, and he calls them a moral person. But there is a problem, of course. And this problem is what I call the decoupling of external freedom for moral responsibility. So this final reflection, it's more about, if we don't want to renounce, right, to the idea of autonomy, of course that is what the autonomy-based model would highlight, right? We should take in consideration how, in the digital world, our personal autonomy is affected. And in this sense, we could relate it to the possibility of the extension, for instance, of legal personhood to new entities like AI. So basically what's saying here is that if we extend the scope of legal freedom, right? And what I mean is not just about AIs, about or engage in different acts, which today, because of what I was saying about big data and so on, are in many cases already determined beforehand. But that is an expression of legal freedom. So if we are going to extend legal freedom in this sense, we should care about the question which underlines the whole model, which is personal autonomy. And I don't have much time, but I just want to finish saying that I'm not with the autonomy-based model. I think that there is one problem which affects both models, which is basically that both models are based in the idea of that the agents are self-sufficient. So dependency is a problem, but if we look, again, this idea of the social networks, we came to the idea that maybe a new approach to the idea of autonomy law should maybe include the idea that dependency could be part of independence. And yeah, I think I'm done. Thank you.